There is a question buried inside the greatest achievement in human history, and the Imperium of Man has spent 10,000 years trying not to ask it out loud. The question is not about war. Every civilization that has ever lasted long enough to leave records has answered the war question, solved the riddle of violence at least provisionally, learned to make weapons that were adequate to the enemies it faced. War is not the problem. War is the context. The problem is something harder, something that lives inside the solution rather than in the threat the solution was designed to address. The question is this: what do you do when the weapon you built has a soul? Not a metaphorical soul, not the vague humanistic sense in which we call anything complex and costly and capable of surprising its creators a soul. A literal one. A self. A consciousness that persists between battles, that thinks and remembers and feels and asks its own questions about what it is and what it is for. A weapon that can refuse. A weapon that can grieve, a weapon that can, under the right circumstances, turn. The Emperor of Mankind created 20 Space Marine legions. He built them from the genetic templates of beings he had himself designed, implanted their potential into the bodies of young men selected from the hardest worlds in a recovering galaxy, and sent them across the stars to reclaim a civilization from the darkness that had nearly consumed it. He made them magnificent. He made them loyal. He made them capable of things that ordinary humans cannot conceive of from the outside. Looking at the armored giants who walk through fire and do not burn, who absorb injuries that would kill 10 men and keep fighting, who carry inside them the biological inheritance of beings that the universe has never produced by accident. And somewhere inside all of that, something looked back at him. This is the story of how the Space Marines were made. Not the mythology, not the simplified liturgy that the ecclesiarchy teaches to novices who will spend their lives in service to a throne whose occupant is no longer in any position to correct their misunderstandings. The actual story. The long, expensive, morally intricate story of a project that took a century to conceive, another to execute, and 10,000 years to begin to understand the consequences of. It begins, as most of the darkest things in human history begin, with a problem that seemed straightforward at the time. The problem was Terra, and the things that Terra had become. And it begins specifically with the men who came before, the ones who made the Astartes possible by first demonstrating, in the most absolute terms available, what the Emperor could not afford to build again. Before there were Space Marines, there were Thunder Warriors. And the Thunder Warriors are where this story has to start. Not because they were lesser, though they were in the end undone by what they were, but because you cannot understand what the Emperor made when he made the Astartes without understanding what he had made first, and why it was not enough, and what it cost him to admit that, and what it cost the Thunder Warriors to have been the proof. Every great achievement casts a shadow behind it. The shadow of the Space Marines is older than the Space Marines themselves. It has a name. It is not spoken often, not in the temples and the indoctrination halls where the Adeptus Astartes mythology is maintained at its most polished and most useful. But the name exists in the oldest records, in the archives that survived the unification, in the accounts of men who were there and who wrote down what they saw before time and the Imperium's institutional memory could decide what was worth preserving. The name is the Thunder Warriors. And they were, in their time, the most dangerous human beings who had ever lived. To understand the Thunder Warriors, you have to understand what Terra was before they existed. Because the Thunder Warriors were not a philosophical project or a scientific ambition. They were an answer to a specific and immediate emergency, built under conditions of extraordinary pressure by a being who had watched humanity decline for 2,000 years and had decided that the declining was going to stop. Terra, in the age of strife, was a ruin. Not the clean ruin of a world that had been destroyed quickly, bombed from orbit or consumed by plague or shattered by some catastrophic failure of the systems that kept it alive. The clean destruction at least has a clarity to it, a before and an after, a point at which the survivors can look around at what remains and begin the work of understanding what comes next. Terra's ruin was slower than that, and in some ways worse. It was the ruin of accumulation, the specific catastrophe that happens when a world of sufficient complexity loses the capacity to manage itself, and the complexity becomes the disaster. The galaxy had broken during the Age of Strife. The warp had turned hostile. Psykers across human space had erupted without warning or preparation. Ships had been lost. Communication had failed. The vast network of trade and governance and mutual dependency that had sustained humanity through the dark age of technology had simply come apart. And Terra, the cradle world, the original home of the human species, the world whose name had been synonymous with humanity's dominion over the stars, had fallen with everything else. By the time the Emperor began his work, Terra was a patchwork of warring territories, each controlled by a different faction or warlord, each hostile to the others, each carrying the specific madness of a civilization that had been fighting itself for so long that fighting had become the only language it remembered. The techno-barbarians had their fortresses, the gene cults had their mutations, the mutant armies had their territory, the feral raiders had theirs, the religious fanatics had theirs. The sky above certain regions glowed with the emissions of weapons that should not have existed on a planet without the industrial capacity to maintain them, maintained anyway by the specific stubborn violence of people who had decided that the weapon was worth more than the food they were not growing because they were too busy fighting over the weapon. Billions lived on Terra. Most of them lived badly. Many of them lived very briefly. The Emperor had watched this. He had not watched it passively, had not been a mere observer of history, but he had moved through the Age of Strife as something other than the openly dominant force he would become. He had been present in human history for longer than almost anyone understood. A being of extraordinary psychic power and extraordinary longevity, who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, who had guided and shaped and occasionally intervened, but who had not yet chosen to step forward and declare what he was and what he intended. He had reasons for waiting. The reasons were tactical as much as philosophical. The patience of a being who understood that the moment of action mattered as much as the action itself, that moving too early was as bad as moving too late, and that moving at all required having something to move with. He had knowledge, he had ability, he had the capacity potentially to reshape what Terra was. But knowledge and ability and capacity are not armies, and the territory he needed to reclaim was held by men with armies. He needed soldiers. The soldiers he had access to were human, which meant they were mortal, which meant they died, which meant replacing them was an ongoing problem, which meant the campaign to unify Terra by conventional military means was an exercise in accounting that the opposition could simply outlast if it was patient enough. One war of attrition, fought against an enemy that could recruit from the same planetary population, and that had no particular interest in strategic coherence, just in survival and the continuation of its own power. That war could last decades. It was lasting decades. The Emperor had begun the unification long before the Thunder Warriors existed, but the pace of it, the grinding, slow advance across a continent at a time, was not adequate to what he understood the situation required. He understood something that the warlords of Terra did not, partly because they did not want to, and partly because their frame of reference was too small to contain it. The Age of Strife was not a local problem. It was a symptom of a galactic crisis that had not yet reached its most acute phase. The warp, already turbulent, was growing worse. The powers that moved within it were not quiescent, and humanity, scattered and fractured and fighting itself on 1,000 worlds, was not prepared for what was coming. He needed Terra unified. He needed it now, not in the decades that conventional war would require. And he needed, to accomplish that, something that conventional soldiers could not be. The answer he arrived at was the Thunder Warriors. The methodology was the Emperor's own, refined over centuries of study of human biology and the specific mechanisms by which the human body could be pushed past its natural limits. He was not working in the dark. He had the knowledge of the dark age of technology to draw on, the accumulated science of a civilization that had achieved things with the human body and the human genome that the post-strife remnants had mostly lost. He had his own capacities, his own understanding of the interplay between biology and psychic potential, of the specific vulnerabilities and specific extraordinary resiliences that the human organism contained. What he built was extraordinary. What he built was also, in the end, insufficient, not because his science failed him, but because the urgency that drove the project created choices that a less pressured timeline would not have required. The Thunder Warriors were built to win a war. They were not built to last. This distinction would matter enormously, and sooner than anyone who stood in the unification campaigns and watched those giants fight could have imagined. The Thunder Warriors were large. This sounds like a simple statement, the beginning of a physical description, but largeness in this context means something specific that physical description alone cannot capture. A space marine in full battle plate stands approximately 8 feet tall. The Thunder Warriors were larger than space marines. In the period before the Astartes existed, before anyone had a comparison point for what the Emperor's engineering could produce, the Thunder Warriors must have seemed like something mythology had generated, beings of a scale that the human mind categorizes as impossible, and then has to accept when the evidence is standing in front of it. Their bodies were the products of modification programs that the Emperor himself oversaw, the biological work done in laboratories beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace, carried out by the Emperor and by the most skilled gene wrights and biological artificers he could find or create. The modifications were extensive. Skeletal reinforcement that made their bones harder than the materials that war machines were built from. Muscular augmentation that gave them the strength of industrial equipment. Organ systems redesigned to make them resistant to toxins, to damage, to the specific biological vulnerabilities that killed ordinary soldiers in the field. adrenal systems that could be triggered to produce combat states that ordinary human physiology cannot reach and sustain. They were, by any external measurement, magnificent. The process of making them was also extremely costly in terms of the raw material it required. Not every candidate survived the modifications. The procedures were not yet refined to the degree that the Astartes program would eventually achieve, and the losses during the creation process were significant. Many who entered the modification labs did not come out. Those who did emerge were changed in ways that were difficult to fully categorize, because the changes were not only physical. The Thunder Warriors were aggressive. This is the polite word. The modifications that gave them their physical capabilities operated in part by amplifying the hormonal and neurological systems that drove combat behavior, and the amplification was not precise. A Thunder Warrior in battle was a creature of extraordinary violence, capable of driving through opposition that would stop any ordinary soldier, capable of sustaining damage and continuing to function, capable of feats that made him terrifying to face even to other soldiers who were accustomed to violence. This was what they were built for. This was what the unification required. But the aggression did not stop when the battle stopped. A Thunder Warrior in a garrison, on rest, in a camp between campaigns, was still a being whose internal chemistry was running at a level that ordinary human neurology was not equipped to manage. They were quarrelsome in ways that required constant management. Disputes between warriors could escalate to lethal violence in the time it took a supervising officer to cross the camp. Their relationship to authority was functional, but required the authority to be physically capable of enforcing itself, which meant that the officers who managed Thunder Warrior units were either also Thunder Warriors or were men of extraordinary personal bravery who had accepted the risk of their position as a condition of the job. The Emperor was aware of this. He was not surprised by it. The aggression was, in a tactical sense, a feature rather than a flaw. A Thunder Warrior who was incapable of being fully passive between battles was a Thunder Warrior who was never entirely off, never entirely out of the combat state, never the kind of thing you could surprise into weakness by timing your attack to coincide with a period of rest. On the battlefield, this was an advantage. Everything about the Thunder Warriors on the battlefield was an advantage. And the battlefield was what they had been made for. What they had not been made for was the long peace that the Emperor intended to follow the unification. But that was a later problem, and the unification was the immediate one. They fought through the campaigns of the unity with a consistency that validated everything the Emperor had invested in them. Fortresses that had held against conventional assault for years fell in weeks to Thunder Warrior spearheads. Warlords who had calculated that their defensive positions were impregnable discovered that the calculation had been performed without the Thunder Warriors as a variable. The genetic warrior orders of the gene cults, those factions that had made their own crude modifications in the dark years of the strife, found themselves facing something that their modifications had not prepared them for. Something more thoroughly made, more completely transformed, more absolutely committed to the purpose of conquest. The Emperor fought alongside them at times, and those who saw him in this period describe a figure of terrifying capability. A being whose psychic power and physical prowess operated at a level that even the Thunder Warriors seemed in awe of. But the Emperor also understood something the Thunder Warriors did not, which was that he was not fighting to win battles. He was fighting to win a world. And the Thunder Warriors were the instruments of that larger ambition, not its endpoint. There was something else about the Thunder Warriors that accounts from the period mentioned consistently, something that goes beyond the physical description and the tactical record. The warriors who survived long enough to accumulate significant service time began to show changes that the original modification programs had not anticipated. Not immediately. Not in the first years of the unification, when the campaigns were fresh and the warriors were new. But over time, as the modifications continued their work in bodies that had not been designed to accommodate them indefinitely, things began to go wrong. The skeletal enhancements that made them nearly indestructible in battle did not stop enhancing. The hormonal amplification that made them so terrifyingly aggressive in combat did not moderate with time. They continued steadily to become more of what they had been made to be. And the excess of what they had been made to be was not something their bodies could contain indefinitely. They grew, some of them, beyond what even they had been at their creation. They became less stable, not more. The madness that was present in them from the beginning, managed and directed by the discipline of the unification campaigns, grew as the modifications deepened their hold on systems that had never been designed to accept them long-term. The Thunder Warriors were breaking down, not all at once, not in a way that was immediately visible from outside. The process was slow enough to be managed campaign by campaign, battle by battle, the worst cases removed from service on whatever pretext was available, the problem acknowledged in private by those who oversaw the program and denied in public for reasons that the campaign needed the Thunder Warriors to be reliable right up until the moment they were no longer needed. Because the Emperor knew. He had always known. The Thunder Warriors were a solution to an immediate problem, built with the tools available and the time available. And what they were was good enough for the purpose they had been given. But what they were was not good enough for what came after. And what came after was the rest of human history, which the Emperor intended to personally supervise, and which was going to require soldiers of a very different kind. He was already thinking about what those soldiers would need to be. He had been thinking about it almost since the Thunder Warriors were made. The unification wars lasted, depending on how you define their beginning and end, somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries. The Emperor did not announce them with a manifesto or a declaration. He did not issue demands that were refused and then respond with force in the conventional political pattern. What happened was more gradual than that, and in some respects more frightening, because the steady, methodical advance of a force that does not announce itself gives its opponents very little time to adapt before the territory that might have hosted an alliance or a coalition has already been taken. He began from a position of relative strength in what would eventually be named the Himalayan ranges, and he moved outward. The early campaigns were not primarily Thunder Warrior operations. They were smaller, more surgical, and they had the quality of the Emperor establishing what he was before he revealed the full extent of what he had. Warlords were approached, sometimes with offers and sometimes with evidence of what would happen if the offers were refused. The evidence was usually the Thunder Warriors. A demonstration was arranged. A stronghold fell that had been considered impenetrable, and then the offer was repeated. Some accepted. The ones who did not found out what a full Thunder Warrior assault looked like from the inside. The techno-barbarian kingdoms that controlled much of the ancient continent called Europa were the first to face Thunder Warriors in numbers sufficient to understand what they were. These were not simple war bands or tribal confederacies. They were, by the standards of the Age of Strife, sophisticated powers, possessing technologies that their enemies could not field, maintaining standing armies of professional soldiers, and having survived long enough to develop the institutional knowledge of war that comes from fighting it continuously for several generations. They were confident. They had reason to be confident, or they had believed they had reason until the morning their forward positions reported contact with something they could not classify as any known type of soldier. The battles of the Europa campaigns are recorded in fragments. The records from this period are incomplete, the documentation of the unification being in some respects less thorough than documentation of events 10,000 years later, partly because the emperor was not yet in the business of celebrating himself at institutional scale, and partly because the civilization that might have recorded these events was in the process of being restructured. What survives is enough to understand what the Thunder Warriors did to armies that were expecting to face human opponents. They did not behave like infantry. Their standard tactical approach was not to advance and exchange fire and trade ground in the pattern of conventional warfare. They moved through terrain in ways that conventional infantry could not replicate, covering distances at speeds that tactical planning did not anticipate, hitting defensive lines at points that the defenders had not identified as most vulnerable, because the defenders had calculated vulnerability based on what human soldiers could do. And the Thunder Warriors were not human soldiers in any functional sense. The psychological effect of their appearance was significant and consistent across accounts. Something that was the size of a Thunder Warrior, moving at the speed of a Thunder Warrior, absorbing the weapons fire that should have stopped it and continuing to close the distance, produced in ordinary soldiers a specific and not entirely irrational response that was not compatible with the maintenance of organized resistance. Fortresses fell. Cities submitted. The warlords who survived did so by making the decision that survival was worth more than the specific configuration of power they had held until the Thunder Warriors arrived. By the midpoint of what would later be called the Unification Wars, the Emperor controlled a significant proportion of the territory that would eventually become the Imperial Heartland. The campaigns that remained were harder, because the enemies he had not yet faced were, by selection, the ones who had survived everything else, the most defensible positions, the most fanatical resistance, the most deeply entrenched factions with the deepest investments in not being unified by anyone on any terms. The gene cults were among the last to fall, and they are worth dwelling on for a moment because of what they represent. These were human factions that had pursued their own versions of the biological modification that the Emperor was pursuing with the Thunder Warriors, doing so with the cruder tools and cruder understanding of the Age of Strife, and producing results that were grotesque and extraordinary in roughly equal measure. They had made their warriors larger and stronger through processes that did not understand what they were doing at the level that the Emperor's work understood it. Their warriors were dangerous. They were also suffering from the same problem that the Thunder Warriors were beginning to show, and at greater degrees because their modifications were even less refined. The Emperor, fighting the gene cults, was in some respects looking at a warning about himself. The gene cult warriors were what the Thunder Warriors would eventually become if nothing intervened. And the Emperor was watching, with the specific attention of someone who has already decided that the thing being observed is not acceptable as a permanent outcome. He was refining his understanding. Every campaign was also a laboratory. Every enemy also a data point in the project he was already planning. The unification was, by most measures, complete within the Emperor's first century of open operation. The last significant holdouts were reduced. The last warlords who had believed their particular combination of technology and territory made them immune to what the rest of Terra had experienced discovered that they were wrong. And the planet was, for the first time in its recorded history since the collapse, under a single authority. The Thunder Warriors had done this. The Thunder Warriors had driven the campaigns that made this possible, had broken the defenses that had resisted everything else, had been the instrument through which the Emperor's will was made physical on a planetary scale. They had earned everything that the unification represented. And the Emperor, who had been making plans for what came after the unification throughout the campaigns of the unification itself, now had to deal with the Thunder Warriors' future. There was not going to be a good way to do this. There was never going to be a good way to do this. From the moment the first Thunder Warrior was made, from the moment the Emperor understood what making them required, and what the long-term consequences of those requirements were, the conclusion had been visible. He had made a choice, at the beginning, to build soldiers for a war rather than soldiers for a civilization. And the war was over. And the soldiers were still here. And the soldiers were getting worse. The Thunder Warriors knew what they were. Some of them, the ones who were still coherent enough to articulate it, knew it with a clarity that made what followed more, not less, painful. They were not ignorant of their own instability. They were living inside it, experiencing from the inside the slow acceleration of the processes that were remaking them past anything they had consented to or anticipated. And the experience was described in the fragments that survive from this period, with a quality of terrible self-awareness that the mythology of the Astartes has largely erased. The Thunder Warriors knew what they had been made for, and they knew what was happening to them, and they knew that the Emperor knew too. The records of what happened to the Thunder Warriors after the unification are among the most carefully managed documents in Imperial history. Not destroyed. The Emperor was not in the business of destroying information. Understanding as he did that information has a way of surviving destruction in forms that denial and obscurity do not create and cannot control. But managed. Framed, filed in the archives that were accessible to the people who needed to understand the precedents rather than to the wider historical record that was going to shape what the Imperium believed about itself. What happened is not disputed among those who study it. The Thunder Warriors were eliminated. The Emperor arranged for the removal of the warrior program he had built. The retirement in the most permanent sense of the soldiers who had won him a world. The exact mechanisms are not fully clear across all cases. The program was phased out rather than ended in a single event. The declining stability of the warriors, providing practical cover for the withdrawal of those who were already compromised by their modifications. The more deliberate removal of those who were not yet compromised, but who would be eventually. Some Thunder Warriors died in the final campaigns of the unification itself, deployed against the last and most dangerous holdouts in a manner that was not wasteful of their capabilities, but that was also not particularly careful of their survival. Some died in the period after, as the modifications that had driven their power began to drive their failure. The systems that had been over-engineered for the short term proving exactly as unsuited for the long term as the Emperor had always known they would be. Some were removed by more direct means, by the specific force required to stop a Thunder Warrior who was no longer coherent enough to be managed by authority or persuasion. A few survived long enough to understand what was happening, and their accounts of that understanding are the most difficult to read of anything that survives from this period. A soldier who has fought for a cause and been discarded when the cause was won is a figure that appears in many historical traditions, and the emotional and moral weight of the situation is usually analyzed from the outside. The Thunder Warriors who retained enough coherence to leave records analyzed it from the inside, and what they wrote and spoke has the quality of people who are not surprised by what is being done to them, who expected it in some sense, and are still somehow not entirely reconciled to it. The Emperor did not celebrate the removal of the Thunder Warriors. He did not, so far as the records indicate, mark it. He was already somewhere else, working on the problem that the Thunder Warriors had solved one version of, and that now required a different solution. A better solution. One that would not produce the same conclusion 20 or 50 years down the road. He was building something new. He had been building it for years already. There is a question that the removal of the Thunder Warriors raises, and it is worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. The Emperor was not a cruel being. Not in the conventional sense of cruelty that takes pleasure in suffering or that treats the suffering of others as irrelevant to moral consideration. He was capable of acts that produced enormous suffering, and he was capable of making decisions that prioritized the outcome over the cost of reaching it, but these are different qualities from cruelty in the simple sense. He felt the weight of what he did to the Thunder Warriors. The evidence suggests he felt it as something that needed to be done, not as something he wanted to do. But he did it. He did it because the alternative, allowing the Thunder Warriors to persist into the world he was building, as they were, with the trajectory they were on, was not an option he could accept. A Thunder Warrior who had degraded past the point of functional coherence was not a retired soldier. He was a catastrophic risk to anything in his vicinity. The specific chemistry of what they were becoming, the amplification of the aggression systems without the physical deterioration that in a human body would eventually limit the expression of that aggression. A fully degraded Thunder Warrior was not a person in any meaningful sense, was not even a soldier in any functional sense. He was a biological weapon, pointed in no particular direction, which made him a threat to everything indiscriminately. The Emperor was also thinking about what came next, and what came next required the resources, the facilities, the attention and the expertise that maintaining and managing a deteriorating Thunder Warrior program would consume. He could not afford to spend those resources on soldiers who were already obsolete when he was already building the ones who would replace them. The lesson he drew from the Thunder Warriors was not that the project of creating enhanced soldiers was wrong. The lesson was about what the project required in order to be right. He understood, having seen the Thunder Warriors, what the failure modes were, what the specific biological and psychological instabilities were that his first attempt had produced. And he understood them with the precision of someone who had not only watched the failure happen externally, but had designed the program closely enough to understand it mechanically. The next program would not fail in those ways. The next program would not fail in those ways because the next program would begin from a completely different starting point. not from the outside in, modifying an existing human body with augmentations that the body's systems would eventually reject or overexpress or simply fail to contain. From the inside out, beginning with the genetic architecture itself, with the blueprint from which the body was built, rewriting it at the foundational level so that what emerged was not a modified human being, but something categorically different. Not an augmented human, a new kind of being. To do this, he needed templates. He needed the genetic starting points from which the new being could be built, the foundation genes that would provide the framework for everything else. He needed, in other words, to first build the things from which the new soldiers would be derived. He needed to build the Primarchs. And that project, the greatest act of biological creation in human history, was already underway in the deepest levels of the structure that would become the Imperial Palace, in laboratories that were known to very few people and understood by fewer still. The Emperor built his sons. The word sons is the one that has survived into the mythology, the one that the legions used for their Primarchs, and that the Primarchs used in their relationship to the Emperor, and it carries the emotional weight that the biological reality requires a word to carry. But the biological reality is also worth naming clearly, because the mythology sometimes obscures it in ways that make the Primarchs seem more mysterious than they were, or less extraordinary. The Primarchs were, in the most precise available sense, the Emperor's children. They were built from his genetic material, from the specific extraordinary genome of the most powerful human being who had ever lived, used as the foundation from which 20 separate masterworks were derived. Each one began there and was then elaborated, differentiated, given the specific qualities that the Emperor intended each one to carry, the individual character that would make each Primarch a distinct personality and a distinct military asset, and a distinct answer to the different problems that reclaiming the galaxy was going to require. 20 Primarchs, 20 separate projects, each one unique, each one carrying the Emperor's genetic foundation in a different expression of what that foundation could produce. Physical frames that exceeded the human in every measurable dimension, but exceeded it in different ways. The Primarch who was the master of speed, and the Primarch who was the master of endurance, and the Primarch who was the master of siege, and the one who was the master of loyalty, and the one who was the master of inspiration. Different instruments, all built from the same extraordinary starting material, each one tuned to a different frequency of excellence. The Emperor worked on them for years before any of them were complete. The project was not one he could delegate, not fully, because the level of understanding required to do the genetic work at the level it needed to be done at was not something any other being possessed. He had collaborators, the most skilled members of the Martian Mechanicum, and the most gifted biologists of the Proto-Imperium. But the foundational work, the work that determined what each Primarch was at the deepest biological level, was his own. What he created was not yet people. In the early stages of the program, the Primarchs existed as biological material in gestation vessels, developing at the accelerated rate that their engineering permitted, beginning the process of becoming what they were designed to be. They were not yet awake. They were not yet conscious in the full way of beings who then the beings they would eventually become. They were potential, held in a careful balance of biological process and technological support, waiting for the completion of a development that was only partly biological and partly something harder to describe. The psychic dimension was part of this, and it was also the dimension the Emperor was most careful about. The Primarchs were psychers, all of them, beings whose connection to the warp was extraordinary, and whose ability to affect the world around them through that connection exceeded anything a baseline human could achieve. But Psyker was too simple a word for what they were. They were beings through whom the warp expressed itself in ways that the warp's usual relationship to humanity did not produce. Not simply as a channel for psychic power in the operational sense, but as something more fundamental, a quality of being that made each Primarch a gravitational point in the immaterium, a weight in the dream logic of the warp that corresponded to what they were in, physical reality. The Emperor understood this. He was working with it deliberately, the psychic character of the Primarchs as intentional as their physical character, each one shaped to have a relationship to the warp that complemented their physical and strategic role. And he understood something else, which was that beings of this nature attracted attention from the entities that inhabited the warp. That what he was building in those laboratories beneath the palace was not going unnoticed by the powers that had an interest in what happened in reality. He took precautions. He worked toward the project, to hide it, to make it as invisible to the warp as something of this magnitude could be made invisible. He was not naive about the limitations of this concealment. He was dealing with powers that operated outside the normal constraints of time and space, that could perceive the shape of an event before it had fully materialized, that had shown across the long history of the galaxy a capacity to act in ways that conventional defenses were not designed to stop. He was not fast enough, or rather, he could not have been fast enough, because what happened next was the product of a vulnerability that was structural rather than operational, inherent to the project rather than a failure of its execution. The ruinous powers reached into his laboratory, and they took his sons. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic raid that he might have detected and responded to. The Chaos powers do not break through defenses directly. They move through the seams between them, finding the gaps rather than forcing the locks, unmaking protections from the inside rather than overcoming them from without. The gestation vessels were scattered, 20 developing Primarchs, each in the individual vessel that contained and sustained them, were taken from the laboratory in which they had been built and dispersed across the galaxy, sent through the warp in trajectories that the Emperor could not fully predict or follow, each one landing on a different world at a different time, each one arriving as an infant into conditions that the Emperor had not chosen and could not control. The records of the moment he discovered this are not preserved. The reaction of a being of his nature to the loss of 20 years of work and 20 children is not something that was documented in real time. What was documented is what he did afterward. He worked. He could not follow the Primarchs immediately. He did not know exactly where they had gone. The warp's dispersal of them had been thorough, and the galaxy was vast, and the task of finding 20 individuals on 20 unknown worlds among the stars was not something he could accomplish, while also building the Imperium he needed to build to be able to send anyone anywhere to find them. What he did instead was to refuse to allow the loss to be final. The genetic material of the Primarchs existed in his records. The blueprint from which each of them had been derived was not lost simply because the Primarchs themselves had been scattered. He could not rebuild the Primarchs from scratch. The development of a Primarch was not simply a matter of replicating genetic material, but of the specific individual development that had already occurred and could not be replicated identically. But he could use the genetic material he had to create something derived from the Primarchs, something that carried the foundation of what they were without being them. He could create the legions. 20 legions of warriors derived from the 20 Primarchs he had made, carrying within them the genetic inheritance of beings who were, at that moment, developing on unknown worlds across a galaxy that was waiting to be reclaimed. And when the legions eventually found their Primarchs, when the Great Crusade that was coming found those 20 scattered sons, the warriors would recognize their fathers, and the fathers would recognize their children, because the shared genetics would make the recognition something deeper than memory or record. He was, in the moment of his greatest loss, already planning for its reversal. This is the Emperor. Not the mythology, not the god figure that sits on a golden throne while his priests try to make his silence mean something. The actual Emperor. The man who had outlasted civilizations and walked through the age of strife without being broken by it. The man who built the Thunder Warriors and then undid what he had built because it wasn't good enough, and then built something better from the understanding of why it wasn't good enough, and then had that taken from him, and responded by refusing to stop. The legions were the response. They were also in ways that would take 10,000 years to fully appreciate. The beginning of the terrible question. Before there can be Space Marines, there has to be gene seed. This is where the story becomes technically specific and also, in its way, more frightening than anything the Thunder Warriors produced. Because the Thunder Warriors were a crude augmentation program applied to existing humans. The gene seed is something else entirely. The gene seed is the mechanism by which a human being is rewritten. The Emperor spent years developing it. He was working from the genetic material of the Primarchs, using each Primarch's unique biological signature as the template for a corresponding set of engineered organs that could be implanted into a human host, and that would, over a period of years, change that host into something categorically different from what he had been before. Not the same person with added capabilities. Something new. Something that carried within it the expressed potential of a Primarch's genetics, diluted through the implantation process but present in a form that the host body could incorporate and sustain indefinitely. The gene seed consists, in its completed form, of 19 separate engineered organs. Each one serves a specific function. Each one interacts with the others in a system of biological relationships that the Emperor designed with the same care that went into the Primarchs themselves. Perhaps more, because the Primarchs were singular masterworks and the gene seed had to be reliable at scale, had to work in thousands of human bodies rather than in one, had to survive the variation between individual human genomes, without failing catastrophically when it encountered something it hadn't been designed around specifically. The 19 organs are a complete redesign of what human body is and what it can do. The secondary heart is perhaps the simplest to understand and the most immediately meaningful for survival. A Space Marine has 2 hearts. And the second one is not merely a backup but an active participant in the circulatory system that makes everything else possible. When one heart is damaged, the other compensates. When both are functioning at normal capacity, the circulatory support they provide together is what allows the other organs to function at the levels they require. The os medulla is what happens to the skeleton. The bones of a space marine are not simply dense human bones. They are remodeled, fused in some places, restructured in others, reinforced throughout with biological compounds that the os medulla produces continuously throughout the first years of a marine's development. A fully developed space marine skeleton is capable of absorbing impacts that would shatter an ordinary human framework. The rib cage, in particular, is fused into a near-solid plate that protects the chest cavity in ways that body armor alone cannot replicate. The biscopy addresses the musculature. A space marine's muscles are not simply larger versions of human muscles. They are differently structured, capable of output and of sustained effort that baseline human muscle tissue cannot achieve, made possible by the specific redesign of muscle fiber type and energy metabolism that the biscopy enables. There is an organ that filters poisons, and one that allows a space marine to become consciously aware of the taste of blood and extract limited information from it, and one that produces a natural armor-like subdermal coating, and one that controls the response to pain and sleep and metabolic rate, and one that allows the marine to enter a near-death coma that preserves the body when conventional survival is not possible. There is the omophagia, an organ that allows a space marine to absorb limited genetic memory and instinct from whatever he consumes. Eating the flesh of a creature native to a hostile environment imparts, at a level below conscious thought, the instinctive knowledge that creature carries about how to survive there. It is a rough inheritance rather than a clear record, sensation and instinct rather than formed memory. But it gives the Astartes a relationship to the alien and the unfamiliar that no amount of briefing documents can replicate. There is an organ that produces the biological compounds that bond the skin to the power armor in a way that makes the armor not simply protection worn on the outside, but an extension of the body itself. 19 organs. Each one a masterwork of biological engineering, each one a piece of a system designed not to augment a human body, but to replace what a human body fundamentally is, with something built to last, built to sustain, built to do what the Thunder Warriors could never do, remain what they were made to be for a lifetime, that could extend across centuries. The process of implanting gene seed was not quick, and it was not without cost. The candidates for Space Marine initiation were young, adolescents, most of them, at the age when the human body is still sufficiently plastic to accept the implants, and to complete the growth phase that the implants required. Younger than might be expected, given what the process produced, because the extraordinary physical development of a space marine required the extraordinary energy of a body still actively growing in order to occur without killing the host. Not every candidate survived the process. This is stated clearly in the records, and it is not stated as an embarrassment. It is stated as a fact of what the implantation required. The human body subjected to 19 separate organ implantations over a period of several years, each one changing the internal environment that the next implant would be introduced into, was under extraordinary stress throughout the process. And stress killed some candidates regardless of how well selected they had been, regardless of how carefully the implantation was managed, regardless of how closely the progress was monitored. The attrition rate varied between Legion programs and between periods, but it was never zero. The ones who survived were not the ones who survived unchanged. There is a before and after to becoming a space marine that is not gradual in the way that human development normally is. Human beings change slowly enough that the individual experiencing the change cannot usually perceive the change directly. You do not feel yourself growing older. You simply are older when you compare the current state to a remembered past state. The gene seed change was not like this. The candidates who went through the implantation process were aware of what was happening to them in the specific and sometimes alarming way of people whose bodies were visibly, measurably, rapidly becoming something they had not previously been. Bones breaking and reknitting in their new forms. Muscles growing at rates that tore the old tissue as the new tissue replaced it. Eyes changing in many legion gene strains. From the colors they had been born with to something that the gene seed determined was appropriate to what the warrior was becoming. Height increasing by amounts that exceeded any natural human growth phase in time periods that no natural human growth phase could encompass. It hurt. The records are quite clear that it hurt, and that enduring the pain was itself part of the selection. Not sadistically, not as a designed cruelty. The ability to endure the transformation was correlated with the physical and psychological qualities that made a viable space marine, so the pain was partly selection pressure, and partly simply the honest cost of what was being done to the body. A candidate who broke under the pain of transformation would not have been a viable space marine. The pain was the first proof that the candidate could be one. What emerged from the process, years after it began, was not a boy and not a man in the ordinary sense, and not the Thunder Warrior alternative of a human body pushed past its limits by external modification. What emerged was the thing the Emperor had spent years building the possibility of. A being whose extraordinary capability was not held in tension against the body it inhabited, fighting against the biological systems that were trying to remain human and failing progressively over time. A being whose capability and whose biology were one and the same thing, whose extraordinary capability was not an addition but a nature. A space marine. The first space marines emerged into their new existence and tried to understand what they had become. This is perhaps the moment in the whole story that is hardest to reconstruct, because the records of the earliest legionaries are the records of people who were themselves still in the process of figuring out how to describe their own experience, using language built for a kind of consciousness that they no longer fully inhabited. They were not unable to communicate. The gene seed had not taken their language, their memory, their personality, their individual self, in the sense of the accumulation of experience and preference and belief that constitutes a person. All of that was present. All of that was still them. What had changed was the context in which all of that existed. Imagine being a person of ordinary human capability and then, over several years, having that capability replaced by something that operates on a completely different scale. Not just more different. The strength is not simply greater strength. It is strength that the previous frame of reference cannot fully process, that the brain needs new language to describe, because the old language was built around a different set of physical facts. The perception is not simply sharper, it is richer in ways that add new dimensions to what the world is, rather than simply increasing the resolution of the existing dimensions. The Lyman's ear implant, one of the 19 organs, gives a space marine hearing that can distinguish individual voices in a combat environment at distances that baseline human hearing cannot approach. and can be tuned with conscious attention to filter specific frequencies in and out of active awareness. This is not a larger version of human hearing. It is a different relationship to sound. The first Space Marines processed these changes as human consciousness processes dramatic changes to its own context. Slowly, with the difficulty of trying to describe something new using terms built for something old, and with a tendency to focus on what remained the same rather than what had changed. Because what remained the same was the ground on which the self stood, and the self needed that ground to be stable. They were still themselves. This was the thing they returned to. The process had not replaced them. The person who had entered the implantation program was still present in the person who emerged from it, present in memory and in the specific qualities of individual personality and in the beliefs and attachments that had been theirs before the transformation began. The transformation had not taken those things. It had changed the body and expanded the capability and altered the context. But it had not reached into the essential interior of the self and remade what was there. Whether this was a feature or a flaw is a question that the Imperium's 10,000 years of experience with Space Marines suggests may not have a simple answer. The first legionaries were organized into formations from the beginning, because organization was part of what distinguished them from the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors had been warriors first and soldiers second, beings whose primary quality was personal lethality and whose capacity for the kind of coordinated institutional military behavior that an army requires was present but secondary. The Space Marines were built with the institutional dimension as fundamental as the individual one. They were made to fight in formations, trained to do so from the earliest stages of their initiation, given the specific doctrine and the specific vocabulary and the specific habits of mind that military coordination required in a way that the Thunder Warriors had not been. The doctrine came from the Emperor directly. He was not distant from the formation of the legions, in the way that a ruler who creates a project and then delegates its management is distant. He was present in the training, in the development of the tactics that would define what the legions were for, in the specific cultivation of the qualities that distinguished a Space Marine from what had come before. What distinguished a Space Marine in the Emperor's conception was not primarily the capability. The capability was extraordinary and it was necessary, and it was the technical achievement that made everything else possible. But the distinguishing quality, the thing that he had built specifically to be different from what the Thunder Warriors had been, was the stability. A Space Marine was stable, not in the psychological sense of being free from the full range of human feeling. They were not, and the attempt to make them so would not have been compatible with the other qualities the Emperor wanted them to have. Stable in the biological sense, the modifications that made them what they were did not continue to modify them past what the design had intended, did not accumulate into excess, did not escalate the aggression systems past the point that the consciousness could manage them. A Space Marine in garrison was not a Thunder Warrior in garrison, was not a progressively deteriorating biological weapon pointing in no particular direction, was a warrior capable of extraordinary violence and containing within himself the full spectrum of motivations that the capacity for extraordinary violence in service of a cause requires, and at the same time a person capable of the qualities of personhood that the Thunder Warriors' modifications had degraded to the point of meaninglessness. They trained. The training was harsh precisely because preparation for the Great Crusade needed to be harsh. Not because the Emperor valued suffering as a training tool, but because the galaxy they were going to enter was not going to be gentle. They trained in the tactics that the legions would use across the Crusade, in the weapons that the forges of Terra and Mars were producing for them, in the command relationships that would allow formations of Space Marines to operate as extensions of a single strategic will, rather than as collections of individuals whose individual excellence was their primary contribution. They trained also in something harder to describe and harder to train, which was how to be what they were. This sounds vague, and in a sense it is vague, because what it describes is not a skill that can be broken down into component techniques and taught to a reliable standard. It is the process of learning to inhabit a new kind of existence, the process that every Space Marine who has ever been made has had to go through, of learning to understand what has changed and what has not, of learning to be the person they were inside the body they had become, of learning to carry the memory of being human as a resource rather than a wound. The earliest legionaries had this in common with every Space Marine who came after them. They were, in the most fundamental sense, men who had become something else, and were still working out what it meant. The difference was that there was no one ahead of them to look to, no tradition yet established, no record of what the being they had become was like across time. They were the first. They were working out not only their own relationship to their new existence, but the relationship that all the ones who came after would have to negotiate. They were, without entirely knowing it, becoming a culture, not consciously, not through deliberate decision about what the culture should contain and what it should value, through the accumulation of practice and habit, and the choices made under pressure, which is how all cultures actually form, rather than through the deliberate programs that institutions later use to maintain them. The first legionaries were making decisions every day about how to be Space Marines, and those decisions were slowly becoming the tradition that would define what a Space Marine was. And underneath all of this, underneath the training and the doctrine and the emerging culture, there was something that would not resolve itself neatly or quickly. They had been given this extraordinary existence for a reason. The reason was the Great Crusade, the project of reclaiming the galaxy that the Emperor had been building toward through the unification, and through the creation of the Primarchs, and through the development of the gene seed, and through all of the decades of preparation that preceded the moment when the legions would be ready to go. They would fight a war for the whole of humanity. They would do it at the Emperor's direction, for goals he had set, in service of a vision of the human future that he had conceived. This was not a problem, in the sense of being a source of resistance or resentment. They believed in the cause. The gene seed carried within it, among its many biological components, the foundation of a loyalty that was not simply conditioned behavior, but something that operated at a deeper level. A connection to the Primarch whose genetic inheritance they carried that made the cause personal in a way that abstract ideology could not entirely explain. But they were also selves. They also had, inside the extraordinary capability and the trained doctrine and the loyalty, the interior life of people, the specific and individual reactions to experience that constitute personhood, the specific loves and fears and curiosities and griefs that cannot be removed without also removing the person they belong to. What do you do with that when the purpose of your existence is to be a weapon. The first Space Marines were beginning to discover that this was not a question with an easy answer. They were also beginning to discover that the question, once present, did not go away simply because the training and the mission and the culture were all organized around the assumption that it had been resolved. The question would follow the Space Marines for the entire 10,000 years of their existence. It would follow them all the way to the heresy. There is a moment in the gene seed process that the chapters do not typically speak of in their official accounts. Not because it is secret, but because it is interior. And interior experience is the hardest kind to communicate to those who have not had it. And the chapters are not in the habit of trying to explain themselves to beings who could not understand from outside. The moment is the one where the initiate understands, not intellectually but experientially, that the transformation is real. Not the abstract knowledge that the gene seed is being implanted and that the process will change him. He has been told this, has been told it in the specific clinical terms that the apothecaries use for the description of a medical process, and he understood it in the way that you understand a description. The moment of real understanding is different from this, and it is different in the way that living something is different from being told about it. At some point in the years of transformation, sometimes early and sometimes late, and always surprising even to those who were prepared for it, the initiate is doing something ordinary, walking through the training halls, looking at a wall, picking up an object he has picked up 100 times before, and the doing of it is simply different. Not more intense in a way that accumulates gradually from a baseline, different in kind, changed past the point where the old terms apply, where the word ordinary does not describe the experience because ordinary described a relationship to the world that he no longer inhabits. The Astartes who try to describe this later, and many have tried, use different language for the same thing. Some describe it as clarity, a quality of perception sharpened past the threshold, where sharpening is the right word for what has happened. Some describe it as weight, the sense of a new relationship to physical reality that comes with a body that is simply more than it was. Some describe it as loss, the somewhat surprising loss of the self who existed before the transformation began, the person he was becoming, someone he can remember but cannot return to. Someone whose frame of reference is now available only as memory rather than as lived present. The loss is not grief, not in most cases. It is something more complicated than grief. Something that has the quality of grief in the sense of being the acknowledgement of a genuine ending. But that is not only grief, because it is also the arrival of the thing that replaced what ended. He lost the person he was becoming. He became something else. And the something else is what he will be for however many centuries his service lasts, which is a different relationship to duration than the person he was before the transformation was able to have. Centuries. This is one of the things about becoming an Astartes that does not have a human referent adequate to it. A Space Marine might serve for 200 years, 300, in extraordinary cases longer. The gene seed changes the organism's relationship to time, the usual markers of biological time, aging, deterioration, the progressive failing of the systems that keep the body working, are absent or radically attenuated. A Space Marine at 200 years of age does not look like a human being at 200 years of age. He looks like what he is, a being whose biology does not count its years in the same currency. What this means for the self is harder to describe than what it means for the body. A human lifetime is short enough that the self it contains can, more or less, be understood as a single thing, a narrative from beginning to end that has the coherence of a human story. A Space Marine's lifetime is long enough that the self it contains is not a single thing in the same way, is instead a succession of selves that share a continuous memory, but that inhabit, at different points in the career, different versions of the experience of being what they are. The warrior at 10 years of service is not the same person as the warrior at 100. Not in the way that people who are fundamentally unchanged become different people as the years accumulate, but in the more radical way of people who have lived through enough to have actually become different, where the beliefs and the losses and the specific accumulated experience of a century of being a Space Marine have done what experience does to people who pay attention to it. The Astartes tradition, each chapter's specific version of it, addresses this, not by pretending that the warrior at a century is the same as the warrior at a decade, which would be dishonest and would also be useless as guidance, but by providing the framework within which the change is understood and integrated. The chapter's mythology and the chapter's traditions are not only the statement of what the chapter believes, they are the ongoing conversation that the chapter has with the experience of being the chapter, the communal resource that allows individual warriors to find their own experience in the larger story, and to understand what is happening to them in the specific moment as something that the community has encountered before and survived. The warrior who has his worst day, who loses brothers he has fought beside for 50 years on a world that the chapter will not remember, has a place to bring the loss, not a place that resolves it or makes it acceptable, but a place that receives it, that acknowledges it as the kind of loss that matters, that provides the ritual form in which the grief can be expressed and witnessed, and then carried forward into the ongoing service that the chapter's mission requires. This is what the program produced that the specification did not describe. Not just warriors, communities of warriors, with the specific richness of communities that are also traditions, that carry forward the weight of everything they have been through, that give individual experience the context of collective memory and collective meaning. The Emperor built weapons. The weapons built something more. The Adeptus Astartes are that more in every chapter and every warrior and every initiate who survives the transformation and looks at the world through the new perception that the gene seed provides and tries, in the specific interior of a self that is both more than human and still completely human, to understand what they have become and what they are for. This is the origin of the first Space Marines, not the biology, though the biology is extraordinary, not the Emperor's genius, though the genius is real. The origin of the first Space Marines is the question that they started asking the moment they emerged from the gene seed process, that every Space Marine since has been asking in his own version and his own voice, and that the galaxy has been answering imperfectly and at great cost for 10,000 years. The question is still open. The asking continues. 20 Primarchs. That is the number the Emperor created. It is also, in one crucial respect, not the number the records will give you. 2 of the 20, the Aind and Exith in the Legion sequence, have been expunged, their names removed from every archive, their histories erased by a hand that could only have been the Emperor's own, their legions dissolved and their warriors absorbed into other formations without explanation. What the records give back when you look for them is a clean and perfect absence. 2 gaps in the Legion numbering, a sequence that runs from I to XX, with 2 entries that read simply as expunged. The reason is not known. The names are not known. Whatever happened to them happened thoroughly enough that 10,000 years of search has found nothing. This is the most complete silence in the history of an age full of managed silences, and it will not be addressed further here, because the story of the lost Primarchs belongs to a different mystery than the one this script is telling. What matters for this story is that the absence is there, and that it has always been there. The shape of something the Emperor decided at some point in the early Crusade that the galaxy was not going to know. 18 Primarchs then, whose stories can be told, and 20 legions, with 2 gaps in the numbering, carrying forward the full weight of what the Gene Seed program produced. 20 legions, 20 armies of Space Marines, each one ultimately to contain tens of thousands of warriors, each one built from a different Primarch's gene seed, and carrying within that genetic inheritance a different expression of what a Space Marine could be. 20 different answers to the question of what a post-human warrior was like, varying not just in tactical specialty but in character, in the distinct character of the culture that grew up around each legion's particular biological inheritance. The legions were not created all at once. They were raised over the same period that the gene seed programs were being refined, in the years after the unification, but before the Great Crusade had officially begun. As the Emperor built the force that would make the Crusade possible, the process was extended. Because it had to be. The creation of viable Space Marines from candidate pools, the long years of training, the accumulation of the experienced warriors who would provide the institutional knowledge that each legion needed before it could operate independently. All of this took time, and the Emperor had the specific patience of a being who understood that rushing the preparation was how you arrived at the Crusade, with something that resembled what you needed, rather than something that actually was what you needed. Each legion was a living experiment in the specific question of what a Primarch's gene seed produced when it was expressed in thousands of individual human bodies across a training period of years. The answer varied in ways that were consistent within each legion but distinct between them. The warriors of what would become the Ultramarines carried, in their biology and in the culture that emerged from it, a quality of order and method, of systematic excellence, of the belief that the galaxy was a problem to be solved through sufficient application of rational process. The warriors of what would eventually be called the World Eaters carried something else entirely, a ferocity that was controlled and disciplined, but that existed at a level of intensity that other legions found difficult to work alongside without the sense that the control was always provisional, always one sufficiently severe stimulus away from becoming something less manageable. These differences were not accidents of training or culture in the conventional sense. They were in the gene seed, the Primarch whose biology underlay a legion's genetic inheritance, expressed itself in those thousands of descendants in ways that the descendants themselves did not fully understand and could not fully control, carrying forward the qualities of a single extraordinary being into a community of people who had never met that being, but who were nonetheless, in some biological sense, his children. The legion cultures that grew up around these genetic inheritances were therefore not arbitrary. They were the specific, somewhat inevitable expression of what the gene seed produced in human beings who were organized into fighting formations and sent on campaign and given centuries of continuous experience to develop around. The Blood Angels, whose gene seed carried the particular inheritance of Sanguinius, produced warriors of extraordinary aesthetic sensitivity alongside their extraordinary martial capability. Warriors who built things, who found beauty in the galaxy even as they moved through it as conquerors, who carried inside the warrior's craft a quality that was almost artistic, and that made them distinctive in ways that went beyond the tactical. The Space Wolves, whose gene seed came from the Primarch Leman Russ, produced warriors with a quality of pack loyalty and individual expression that made their legion look from outside like a controlled chaos and from inside like the most natural organization in the world. The Emperor had intended some of this, not all of it. The deliberate differentiation of the Primarchs had been designed to produce differentiated legions, but the precise ways in which the differentiation expressed itself in the legions were not all things he had planned or predicted. Emergence is the word that the biologists use for the phenomenon by which complex systems produce outcomes that could not have been derived from the properties of their components through analysis alone. Outcomes that are genuinely new, that surprise even the people who built the components. The Legion cultures were emergent in this sense. They were products of a system the Emperor had built, and they were not all things he had anticipated, and several of them would eventually produce outcomes he had not foreseen. The scale of the legions at their eventual height is worth dwelling on, because it represents a concentration of modified post-human warriors that the galaxy had not seen before, and has not seen in the same form since. The second founding and the Codex Astartes would eventually break the legions into the smaller chapters of 1,000 warriors each, for reasons that the heresy would eventually make devastatingly clear. But before the heresy, the legions were vast. A legion at full strength might contain 20,000 warriors, 30,000, perhaps more in the case of the legions who recruited aggressively and whose gene seed took readily in large candidate pools. The Ultramarines were the largest. Ultimately, the Space Wolves were among the more modest in number, partly by design and partly because the character of the warrior the Space Wolf gene seed produced was not one that could be manufactured efficiently at scale without losing the qualities that made it what it was. 20 legions of Space Marines is a military force of a scale that the galaxy of the Great Crusade could not oppose with anything comparable. The civilizations that the Crusade encountered had their armies, some of them large, some of them technologically sophisticated, some of them the products of military traditions that had evolved over thousands of years in the conditions of whatever region of space they occupied. None of them had anything like the Space Marines. None of them had the biological engineering or the institutional knowledge or the specific combination of individual extraordinary capability and large-scale military organization that the legions represented. This was deliberate. The Emperor had not built the legions to fight on even terms. He had built them to be the definitive military response to whatever the galaxy contained, the force that arrived, and ended the question of whether resistance was viable. This was what the Thunder Warriors had been, at the smaller scale of the unification. But the legions were this, at a galactic scale, and with a durability and stability that the Thunder Warriors had never had. There was also something about the legions that the Thunder Warriors had not been, and that had not been part of the initial specification of the Space Marine program, but that had emerged from what the program actually produced. The legions were communities, not simply armies, not simply collections of individuals who happened to share a gene seed and a training program and a set of objectives. Communities with internal cultures, internal relationships, internal hierarchies that had the specific emotional weight of things that mattered to the people inside them. A legion's brotherhood was real. The bonds between warriors who had trained together, fought together, survived together across decades of the galaxy's most demanding campaigning, were not the manufactured solidarity of a conditioning program. They were the bonds that humans, which is what Space Marines were, underneath everything, form when they share the experiences that forge genuine attachment. This made the legions formidable beyond their individual warriors' capabilities, because a force of beings who are fighting not just for a strategic objective but for each other, who experience each other's deaths as losses in the full emotional sense rather than as operational casualties to be managed, is a force that fights differently from one that does not. It is a force that takes personal risks for its members that pure operational logic would not support. It is a force that can be motivated by things that go beyond orders. It is also a force that is vulnerable to things that go beyond orders. The Emperor understood both sides of this. He had built it deliberately, the Brotherhood as much as the capability, understanding that the Brotherhood was part of what made the capability sustainable over the long campaign that the Great Crusade would require. He had also, in building it, created something that had the properties of a community, and communities have properties that pure military units do not. They have loyalties that are internal as well as external. They have values that are their own as well as the values that their creators intended. They have, in the most fundamental sense, a life of their own. 20 legions, 20 communities of post-human warriors, each one carrying the genetic inheritance of an absent Primarch, each one developing its own culture and its own character in the years of training and early campaign, each one preparing in its own way for the war that was coming. And in the dark of the galaxy, on worlds the legions had not yet reached, 20 children were growing up who would one day come home. The Great Crusade began without a declaration of war, because there was no single entity to declare war against, and no single moment at which the absence of the Crusade became its presence. It was more like a tide than a battle. It gathered strength slowly, spread outward from a point of origin, and by the time any given shore understood what was approaching, the decision about whether to resist had already become much more complicated than it might have been earlier. The point of origin was Terra, from the world that the Emperor had unified, from the installation that was becoming the Imperial Palace, from the forges that the Mechanicum was operating at full capacity to equip the legions and the army, and the ships that would carry them. The Crusade began to move outward into a galaxy that had been dark and fragmentary and isolated for 2,000 years. The Emperor led it personally in those early years, not from behind, not from the strategic remove of a commander who trusts his subordinates and manages by exception and reserves his own presence for the moments when presence is decisive, from the front or close to it, because this is how the Emperor fought, and because in the early Crusade his presence was the difference between a military operation and something that operated on the scale the Crusade actually required. He was the most powerful being in the galaxy, and the most powerful being in the galaxy leading a war in person does something to the war that having him manage it from a distance does not. The early Crusade moved through the regions closest to Terra first, the systems that had once been part of the old human sphere, and that had survived the age of strife in various states of degradation and isolation. Some of these worlds welcomed the Crusade, or something close to welcoming it. They had been waiting the way isolated survivors wait, in the knowledge that they cannot sustain themselves indefinitely, for something that could reconnect them to the larger human project. And the Crusade was that thing. Even if the terms of reconnection were not negotiable in any meaningful sense. Some did not welcome it. The ones that did not welcome it discovered that the legions were everything the engineering had promised. The specific tactical character of the early Crusades' military operations was the character of the legions given purpose, of the training and the culture and the gene seed inheritance expressed on actual battlefields against actual opposition for the first time in the full-scale sense. Individual legions had fought before the formal declaration of the Crusade, in the final campaigns of the unification, and in the operations that the Emperor had used to establish the initial reach of what would become the Crusade's front. But the Crusade as a unified operation, with the full weight of the assembled legions and the army, and the logistical support that the Mechanicum's production capacity provided, was something different in scale from anything that had preceded it. The battles of the early Crusade are extraordinary, not primarily for the military outcomes, which were what the military situation would predict. Overwhelming force meeting less overwhelming resistance in most cases. The legions superior to whatever they faced in ways that made the tactical question not whether but how quickly. The extraordinary quality of the early Crusade is what it felt like from inside. The experience of beings who had been made for this purpose and were now expressing that purpose at full capacity in the theater they had been built for. There are accounts from the personal records of early legionaries that try to describe what it was like to fight in the Great Crusade in those early decades, to be part of the force that was reclaiming the galaxy, to stand in formations of space marines on worlds that had been in darkness for 2,000 years, and to feel, not as abstraction but as lived experience, the weight of what was being done. These accounts have a quality of exhilaration, and a quality of something more complicated than exhilaration, the specific emotional texture of people who have found the purpose they were built for, and who are not entirely sure what to do with the finding. They had been made for this. They had been made for exactly this, in the most literal biological sense possible, made from the genetic material of beings designed to be military commanders of superhuman capability, trained from the moment they survived the gene seed implantation in the specific arts of the Crusades' warfare, given doctrine and equipment and the institutional weight of a legion that existed to prosecute exactly the campaign they were prosecuting. The fit between what they were and what they were doing was, in those early years, as close to perfect as the fit between any soldier and any war has ever been. And yet, the accounts also carry something else, something that is harder to define, and that the writers of the accounts do not always name directly, but that is present as a quality in how they describe the experience. A question that is present without being asked, an awareness of something that the experience of the Crusade was not quite providing an answer to. That the purpose they had been given and that they were serving was adequate to the days of campaign, but not quite adequate to the moments between campaigns. The moments of reflection and rest, and the specific interior experience of a consciousness that is not always in battle. What is a weapon when it is not being used? This is the question that runs beneath the exhilaration, The question that the purpose of the crusade was not designed to address, because the crusade had not been designed with the consideration of what its instruments would do with the parts of themselves that the crusade did not require. The legions were not only weapons. The culture that had grown up in each legion during the years of preparation was not only a military culture in the narrow sense. It contained, alongside the tactical doctrine and the martial tradition, the specific richness of a genuine community, the humor, the specific shared references, the internal mythology, the relationships between individual warriors that had developed over years of shared experience. This community was a resource for the crusade. It was also simply a community with the properties of communities, the capacity for the people inside it to value it for its own sake, to have loyalties to it that were real rather than merely functional. The first Space Marines were finding out who they were, and the finding was happening in the context of the most enormous military operation in human history, which was both the context they had been built for and, in the specific interior sense, not quite sufficient to be the whole of what they needed. The question would be answered, in part, when the Primarchs were found. Finding the Primarchs was going to change everything. There is a version of the finding of the Primarchs that is simple and triumphant. The Great Crusade reaches the world, where a Primarch has been growing up. The Primarch is revealed to the Emperor, who has been searching for him. The legion that carries the Primarch's gene seed recognizes the man who is their genetic father, and everyone takes their proper place in the structure of the crusade. The actual findings were more complicated. Not less momentous, they were among the most significant events of the crusade, each one a turning point in the relationship between the Emperor and the project he was building. But the complexity comes from what the findings actually revealed, which was not simply the location of beings the Emperor had made and lost. It was the character of what those beings had become. The Primarchs had not developed in the Emperor's laboratory. They had grown up on worlds across the galaxy, worlds that had their own histories and their own characters, worlds that had shaped the Primarchs with the specific force that worlds always use to shape the beings who grow up on them. And the Primarchs, who were beings of extraordinary power and extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary adaptability, had absorbed those worlds completely. They had not simply survived the worlds that received them. They had mastered them. They had become, by the time the crusade reached them, the most important thing on every world they were on. Sometimes the ruler, sometimes the hero, sometimes the legend, always the central figure around whom everything else had arranged itself. They had also formed attachments to the worlds that had raised them, to the people who had known them before they knew what they were, to the specific communities that had been the context of their development. These were not abstract loyalties or political alignments. They were the genuine emotional commitments of people. And the Primarchs, despite everything they were people, which is the quality of them that is easiest to underestimate from outside, and that the mythology has never quite decided what to do with. The first Primarch found was Horus. Chthoniya was the world, a mining world whose society had organized itself around the gangs that controlled the mines and the territories that provided the resources the mines required. It was a hard world, as the worlds that Primarchs tended to land on were hard. Not from any deliberate sorting, but because Primarchs had a tendency to land in the conditions that would produce the most extreme version of what they were going to be. Conditions that would develop, rather than simply express their capabilities. Chthoniya made its survivors through violence, and through the specific kind of social intelligence that violent environments reward. And Horus had survived it the way Horus survived everything, by becoming the person around whom everyone else organized. When the Emperor came to Chthoniya, he came for Horus, and what he found was not an infant or an adolescent, but a man who had already done everything that a Primarch on Chthoniya could do with his time. A leader of men who had not yet been told what he truly was, but who knew, at some level that precedes language, that what he was did not fit the available categories. The reunion between the Emperor and his first found son is described in various accounts with various emotional textures, ranging from the formal to the intimate, and the full truth of it is probably not available in any surviving record. What is clear is that Horus recognized his father, and his father recognized him, and from that moment Horus was the first among the Emperor's sons, in a sense that was not only chronological. The War Master, eventually, the most trusted of the Primarchs, the one the Emperor elevated above the others, the one who was given the authority to lead the crusade in the Emperor's name when the Emperor withdrew to Terra to pursue the secret project in the palace's depths. The finding of Horus set the pattern for the other findings, even as the other findings varied from it in every particular. Each Primarch had to be found on their own terms, in the context of what they had become on the world that had shaped them, and each finding was therefore a distinct event with its own character. Robut Gilimon on Macragge, who had built himself into the governor of a civilized world and was in the process of reforming its administrative structures with the specific passion for effective governance that would eventually produce the Codex Astartes. Layman Russ of Fenris, who had to be physically defeated before he would acknowledge any authority. The Emperor accepting the challenge and the duel that followed being one of the few combats in which the Emperor agreed to fight someone without the option of simply overcoming them. Magnus on Prospero, who had already built a city of scholars and had been developing his psychic capabilities for decades. His meeting with the Emperor laden with the specific complications that extraordinary psyker meeting the most extraordinary psyker of all time produces. Vulcan on Nocturne, who had been raised by a blacksmith, and who had become the guardian of a people on a dying world, found in the middle of a contest with another stranger, who turned out to be the Emperor himself, the mythologized version of which the salamanders still tell. The contest that Vulcan lost by the technical terms, and won by the substance of his character. Lorga on Colchis, who had already founded a religion. Perturabo on Olympia, who had turned a feudal world into a fortress. Angron, who was found on the world of New Syria at the end of a slave gladiator rebellion, not victorious but surrounded, his companions dying around him. The rebellion that had run for years finally broken by 7 armies sent to end it. The Emperor arrived not as a liberator, but as an extractor. He teleported Angron from the battlefield without saving the men and women who had fought beside him, who were killed by the New Syrian slave masters in the hours after Angron was taken. Angron had wanted to die with his people. The Emperor decided otherwise, taking his son to a destiny Angron had not chosen, in circumstances that Angron never forgave and that would color his entire relationship to his father and his legion. Each finding was a story. Each story was unique, and each story also shared a quality that none of the accounts quite articulate directly, but that is present in all of them, which is the quality of a recognition that runs deeper than meeting. The legions who carried each Primarch's gene seed had a response to the arrival of their Primarch that transcended anything that the doctrine of military hierarchy explains. Something in them knew. The biological inheritance they carried was the expression of the Primarch's genetics in thousands of individual forms. And when the source of that inheritance arrived, the response was not calculated. It was not a product of the chain of command, not a reflection of the strategic instruction that the Emperor's authority produced. It was something that happened in them without deliberate process. The recognition between a genetic source and its descendants that does not require explanation to occur. The Legion of the Ultramarines, carrying Guilliman's gene seed, standing before Roboute Guilliman for the first time, understanding without needing to be told that this was the man in whose image they had been made. The Space Wolves, standing before Russ, in whom they saw the full expression of the qualities they carried in fragments. The Lunar Wolves, the legion that would become the sons of Horus, standing before Horus Lupercal and understanding, in the way that you understand things that are more fundamental than knowledge, that the question of what they were had been answered. For the legions, the finding of the Primarchs was an ending and a beginning. It was the end of the specific uncertainty about their own nature that had been present since the first Space Marines emerged from the gene seed process and tried to understand what they had become. Not because the Primarchs gave them answers in the intellectual sense. The Primarchs were not philosophers of post-human existence, not in most cases, and the conversations they had with their legions about what it meant to be Space Marines were not primarily philosophical, but because the Primarchs were what the Space Marines were in a more complete form, and seeing what you are in a more complete form resolves uncertainties that you did not even know you had been carrying. It was also the beginning of the arrangement that would define the rest of the Crusade. Primarch and Legion, father and sons, the most powerful military commanders the galaxy had produced, paired with the armies whose biological inheritance they embodied. This was the Emperor's design, the system working as he had intended, the scattered 20 returning to their place in the structure he had built for them. What the design had not fully accounted for was what happened to the Primarchs themselves. They had been on those worlds for decades. The worlds had shaped them with full force, had given them everything that their particular worlds could give in terms of formative experience and emotional investment, and the specific relationships that a lifetime of being the most remarkable person in a community produces. They did not leave all of that behind when the Crusade came for them. They brought it with them. They brought the worlds with them, in the way that people always bring their origins with them regardless of what they become afterward. And what they brought with them was not always the same as what the Emperor had planned for. There is a distinction that the Emperor understood at the technical level, but that he may have underestimated at the human level. And the distinction is between what something is designed to be and what it becomes. The Primarchs were designed to be military commanders of extraordinary capability, genetic templates for the Space Marine legions, and the instruments through which the Emperor would direct the Great Crusade. This is what they were built to be. And they were all of these things, every one of them, in the way that they were all extraordinarily capable commanders, and all provided the genetic foundation of their legions, and all played the role in the crusade that the Emperor's strategy required. But they were also, with the specific completeness that beings of their extraordinary nature could not avoid people. They had desires and beliefs and fears and the specific wounds that childhoods produce. and the specific passions that grow from those wounds. They had relationships to the worlds that raised them, that were not simply strategic affiliations but emotional truths. The kind of attachment that a human being develops to the place and people that formed them, multiplied by the intensity that everything about a Primarch was multiplied by. Several of them never fully resolved the relationship between what they had been on their home world and what the Emperor asked them to be as leaders of the Crusade. Lorgar Aurelian is the clearest example of the gap between design and reality. The Emperor built the Primarchs as instruments of a rational, secular project, the reclamation of the galaxy for humanity, organized on the basis of human reason and human achievement, rather than faith or mythology or the supernatural structures that the Age of Strife suffering had caused various cultures to construct around the unexplainable things they had encountered. Lorgar had grown up on Colchis founding a religion, had spent decades developing a theology of the superhuman, had arrived at the Crusade leading a world that worshipped him as a prophet of divine power. His entire interior life was organized around the concept of divine meaning, and the Emperor, whose specific prohibition was the prohibition on the worship of himself or any other being as a god, required Lorgar to be something that Lorgar's entire interior architecture was incapable of being, without a kind of violence that the exterior would not show. Angron's wound was more immediately visible. The Emperor had arrived on the world where Angron was fighting and losing his final battle and had taken him from the battlefield without permission, and without the ability to save the men and women who had fought alongside him and who died because Angron was not there. Angron never forgave this. Not because the Emperor had been cruel, the Emperor had saved his son's life, but because the people Angron had fought with, the gladiators who were the only community he had known and who died in the battle he had been removed from, were more real to Angron than the abstractions of the Crusade, and more important than the role he was supposed to play in it. The butcher's nails that had been implanted in his skull to make him a better gladiator, that the Emperor could not safely remove, that drove his aggression past any sustainable baseline, made the grief into something that operated at a biological level below the reach of reason or recovery. Magnus the Red was something different again. Magnus was a psyker of extraordinary power, a man who had spent decades developing his relationship to the warp in ways that the Emperor had not supervised, and that produced capabilities that were extraordinary, and that were also, from the Emperor's perspective, compromised by the specific manner of their development. Magnus had made a deal with powers that the Emperor knew the full nature of, and that Magnus understood imperfectly. The specific tragedy of Magnus, which plays out over decades and ends in a catastrophe that his sorcery itself triggers, is the tragedy of a being of genuine intellectual magnificence, who was wrong about the most important thing in the way that only genuinely intelligent beings can be wrong, with complete conviction and extraordinary evidence for their position and a fundamental misreading of the nature of the thing they are dealing with. None of these men were failures of the Emperor's design in the technical sense. All of them were extraordinarily capable commanders who provided exactly the military value the design specified. The failure, if failure is the right word, was at the level of the question the design did not ask. What happens when you make a person with a soul, and that soul is shaped by the world that received them rather than the purpose you intended? The Emperor's answer to this question in the years before the heresy was essentially the same answer he gave to every difficult question that could not be resolved cleanly. He continued. He managed the tensions. kept the legions and their primarchs directed toward the Crusade's objectives, addressed the worst of the friction through the authority of his personal relationship with the primarchs, and the specific diplomatic and strategic adjustments that the worst situations required. He did not resolve the tensions. He managed them. Management across the 2 centuries of the Crusade produced an imperium that covered a significant portion of the known galaxy, brought hundreds of thousands of worlds under the authority of Terra, and created the social and political and military structure that would eventually become the organization that the heresy almost destroyed. Management also produced conditions, the accumulated weight of managed tensions, of the Primarch's unresolved wounds and the Legion's unresolved questions about their own nature and the specific strains that the scale and the duration of the Crusade put on everything. These conditions were not managed away. They were present. They were real. And they were, for anyone paying careful enough attention, visible. The Emperor was paying attention. He had built the Primarchs and the Legions and the Crusade, and he was watching them with the specific attention of the person who knows what he built and is watching to see what it produces. Some of what he saw reassured him. The Legions were magnificent. The Crusade was succeeding. The project of reclaiming the galaxy for humanity was moving forward on a trajectory that, if maintained, would eventually accomplish what he had set out to accomplish. Some of what he saw frightened him. Not in the way that ordinary dangers frightened ordinary beings. The Emperor was not prone to fear in the conventional sense, had too much experience and too much capability for conventional fear to operate on him effectively. But in the way that a craftsman is frightened when he looks at something he has made and sees, in it, the potential for a failure mode he did not build and cannot easily correct. He saw weapons with souls, wondering what they were for. He saw loyalty that was genuine and that was also, for that reason, capable of being genuinely violated. He saw Primarchs who had been shaped by worlds he had not chosen, carrying within them experiences and wounds and beliefs that the Crusade's purpose could not address, and that the Emperor's authority could not resolve. And he saw, perhaps most clearly of all, the specific danger of beings who had been made to be devoted, and who would, if their devotion were redirected, bring to the redirection the same extraordinary completeness that they brought to everything. He withdrew to Terra in the closing decades of the Crusade. He had reasons for the withdrawal that were, in the objective strategic sense, sufficient. The project he was pursuing in the depths of the palace was the most important project he had ever attempted. More important than the Crusade itself, and it required his personal presence and attention in a way that nothing else could require. He gave the Crusade to Horus. He trusted Horus with everything he was building. He may have trusted Horus more than he trusted the system he had designed, and that trust may have been the most human error the most powerful human being who ever lived made. But the system was also what it was, and the system was going to produce what it was going to produce, and what it produced in the end was the heresy, which is a word for what happens when the weapons turn. Before the story reaches its darkness, it is worth spending time with the light. Not because the darkness is avoidable, it is not. It is where the story goes, and the light does not prevent it. But because the Crusade at its height was something, and the something it was deserves to be described on its own terms rather than only as a prelude to catastrophe. The Great Crusade in the century before the heresy was the most extraordinary military and civilizational achievement in human history. More than 1,000 worlds brought back into contact with one another after 2,000 years of isolation. Xenos threats that had consolidated in the dark of the strife, filling the vacuum left by the collapse of the human sphere, broken and driven back or destroyed. Human civilizations that had survived the strife in ways that had badly damaged them, trapped in theocracies or feudalisms or the specific horror of techno-barbarism, encountered by the Crusade and at costs that varied enormously and were not always ones the Crusade was willing to fully name, brought into a structure that could sustain them longer than their current trajectory allowed. The Space Marines were the instrument of all of this. The sharp edge of every campaign, the force that arrived ahead of the army and the mechanicum, and the administrative apparatus that would follow to do the longer work of integration. They were in 100 campaigns simultaneously, the 20 legions spread across the galaxy's frontiers, in the pattern that the Emperor and then Horus directed, each one prosecuting the specific objectives that the strategic plan assigned to it, while maintaining the internal life of a community that was also, in every practical sense, the warrior's home. The accounts of individual Space Marines from this period have a quality of controlled wonder at the galaxy itself, at the variety of it, at the specific extraordinary things that 2,000 years of isolation had produced in the dark. Civilizations unlike anything in the human historical record, alien species whose relationship to existence was structured entirely differently from the human version. Worlds of such beauty and such horror that the language available to describe them was not adequate to the task. The Crusade was, among other things, the first systematic encounter with the full extent of what the galaxy contained, and the beings at the leading edge of that encounter were experiencing something that no previous human generation had experienced at this scale. They fought, constantly. The Crusade was a war, not an exploration. And the fighting was the primary activity that structured the Space Marines' existence on campaign. But even the fighting had a quality that the fighting of the unification had not had, because the scale of the Crusade made each engagement part of something larger that the warrior could perceive even from inside a single battle. The sense that what was being done here, today, in this campaign on this world, was a link in a chain of events whose other end was the human future. The weight of historical significance that the Crusade carried was felt by the Space Marines who prosecuted it, not as an abstraction but as a presence, as the quality of doing something that will be remembered. The Primarchs, once found, transformed this. A legion that was a community of warriors became when the Primarch arrived and took command. Something different in character if not in composition. Something that had a center that it had previously been without. A gravitational point around which the culture and the purpose and the identity of the Legion organized itself in ways that had not been fully possible before. Not because the Primarchs were better commanders than the chapter masters who had led the legions in their absence. Some were not in every respect. And the chapter masters who had built the Legion's cultures were not always entirely comfortable with what the Primarch's arrival changed about those cultures. But because the Primarch was the source of what the Legion was in the most fundamental biological sense, and the presence of that source changed the relationship of the Legion to its own identity. The Lunar Wolves with Horus at their head were something that the Lunar Wolves without Horus could not quite be. Not less. Exactly. Not inferior. But different in the way that a community is different when its founding figure is present, rather than present only as a genetic inheritance and a set of cultural practices derived from that inheritance. Horus gave the lunar wolves a quality that the inherited culture could not fully replicate: the experience of what they had been made to be, made visible in a single extraordinary being who was what they were in its most complete expression. Every legion, when its Primarch arrived, had this experience in its own way. The Ultramarines with Gilliaman became something that Gilliaman's specific genius for organization and administration. His belief in the systematic, his conviction that excellence at scale was achievable through sufficiently rigorous application of the right principles, expressed at the full scale of a legion's human and material resources. The Space Wolves with Russ became more completely what they had always been trying to be: the warrior brotherhood organized around a culture of heroic individual excellence and collective loyalty, given in Russ a figure who embodied both qualities so completely that the culture felt for the first time validated rather than aspirational. This is what the Crusade looked like from inside a legion in those decades. The work of making humanity's future, done by beings who had transcended humanity's limits, and who carried within them the genetic inheritance of extraordinary beings. Done in formation with brothers who were both military colleagues and the closest thing to family that the Space Marines' existence allowed. Done under the command of a Primarch whose presence was the resolution of a question the Legion had been living with since before it knew the question existed. It was, by most measures, magnificent. It was also expensive. The campaigns that seemed straightforward from the historical distance at which they are usually described were not straightforward from inside them. The worlds that resisted the Crusade did not always resist ineffectively. The alien intelligences that had consolidated in the dark were not always simply inferior to the legions who came for them. Some of them had capabilities that the Legion's doctrine had not anticipated, and learning to address those capabilities cost lives. And the lives it cost were not statistics to the legions who lost them, but brothers, named individuals whose deaths the community feels its losses. A Space Marine could not die easily. This was part of the design, one of the 19 organs working continuously to keep the warrior alive past the point that should be survivable. But could not die easily was not the same as could not die. They died. They died on worlds that the histories have forgotten, in campaigns that were not strategically decisive enough to leave a detailed record, in engagements that were described in after-action reports and then filed, and then lost. They died for the Crusade, which was also to say they died for each other, because the Crusade was abstract and the brothers were specific, and in the moment of the decision to hold a position or advance through fire, it was the brothers that the warrior was holding for and advancing for. The grief in the legions was real. The relationship between Space Marines and death was not the casual relationship that a being without meaningful attachments might have to the deaths around it. A Space Marine grieved. He was capable of it. The emotional architecture was present. The relationships that made loss meaningful were present. He did not grieve in the way that destroyed function. The gene seed had, in fact, addressed certain specific aspects of acute grief response, in ways that allowed the warrior to remain operational in the immediate aftermath of a loss. But the grief was there, and it accumulated, and over a career that might span decades or centuries, the weight of it became something that the warrior carried as a real presence, rather than a managed background condition. The chaplains, who emerged in various legions during this period as the institutional keepers of the psychological and spiritual life of the community, addressed this as beings who understood that what they were managing was not dysfunction, but the entirely appropriate emotional response of people with genuine community to the losses that war produced. Their role was not to prevent the grief, but to give it the ritual form that allowed it to be survived, to be integrated into the ongoing life of the legion rather than accumulating as damage that had nowhere to go. This is what the legions were, at their height. Not simply armies, not simply collections of extraordinary biological capabilities organized into fighting formations, communities of beings who had been human and who retained the emotional and social architecture of humanity while operating at a physical and military scale that humanity without modification could not reach, and who were trying to inhabit that combination with whatever grace the combination allowed. The Emperor had made more than he planned. When he built them, he had made something that was going to outlast him. In ways he had anticipated, he had also made something that was going to surprise him. In ways he had not. The Horus heresy did not begin at Istvan. It did not begin with the virus bombs and the slaughter and the moment when the War Master turned and the legions divided and the galaxy caught fire. Those events were a revelation, not a creation. The moment when what had been building became visible, when the tensions and the wounds and the unresolved questions that the Crusade had been managing for 2 centuries produced the outcome that management alone was never going to prevent. To understand the heresy from the perspective of the first Space Marines, from the perspective of what those legions were and what the Crusade had made of them over a lifetime of campaign and loss, and the specific strains of being extraordinary instruments of someone else's vision, you have to understand what the heresy was actually the product of. It was the product of what happens when weapons have souls. Not the specific details, not Lorgar's corruption or Horus's wound at Davin, or the whispered arguments that the ruinous powers made over decades to the Primarchs who would eventually turn. Those details are real, and they matter, and they are the proximate causes of what happened. But the Primarchs who were susceptible to those arguments were susceptible because of the specific wounds and the specific unresolved questions that the Crusade had produced, and those wounds and questions were themselves the products of what the Primarchs were. Beings with souls, shaped by worlds the Emperor had not chosen, carrying loyalties and griefs and beliefs that the Crusade could employ, but could not accommodate in any deeper sense. The weapon with a soul can be broken not by an enemy, but by the specific contradiction at the center of its existence. The gap between what it was made to do and what it experiences doing it. Between the purpose it was given and the inner life that grows up alongside the purpose, and that the purpose was not designed to address. Horus was the most trusted of the Emperor's sons, the most loyal. His loyalty had been the most whole, the most complete, the most central to who he was. He had been the first found, given the longest relationship with the Emperor, elevated to the War Master's position because the Emperor trusted him with the most important military authority in human history. And his turning, when it came, was not a rejection of loyalty so much as the redirection of it. He had been loyal to the Emperor and to the vision the Emperor had shown him. When something chaos, the wound at Davin, the whispered suggestions of beings who understood exactly how to reach the individual vulnerabilities of individual people, convinced him that the Emperor was not what he had believed the Emperor to be. The loyalty that had made him the most devoted of sons became, without his interior orientation shifting, the devotion of a man who believed he was correcting a betrayal. The Primarchs who turned did not turn in the way that the simple histories describe. They did not simply choose evil over good, darkness over light, the ruinous powers over the Emperor in a clear-eyed decision that they must have known was catastrophic. They turned as wounded people turn when those wounds are found by something intelligent enough to identify and work with them. The wound was already there. The Chaos powers did not create the wound. They used it. Lorga wanted to believe in something sacred. The Emperor had told him that the Emperor was not a god, and that the sacred was a lie, and that the proper universe was one of reason and human achievement. Lorga could not inhabit that universe, could not be the thing the Emperor required without destroying something in himself that was more fundamental to him than the duty he owed his father. The ruinous powers offered him gods, and the gods they offered were real, and the evidence for their reality was impossible to deny. The betrayal of the Emperor, in Lorgar's understanding, was the Emperor's betrayal of him, the failure to be the divine figure that Lorgar had needed him to be, the failure to acknowledge the sacred that Lorgar had spent his whole life serving. Perturabo was ground down by the Crusade in ways that the histories record in tactical detail, and that the interior dimension of the grinding makes more acute than the tactical description captures. The Iron Warriors were the Legion's siege specialists, sent to the campaigns no one else wanted, deployed at the fortifications that the more celebrated legions had passed over as too costly for their operational timelines, sacrificed continuously in the grinding work that the Crusade's broad front required, but that the Crusade's glory did not acknowledge. Perturabo kept account, the losses of his legion, the specific campaigns that the Iron Warriors fought and that no one celebrated, the distance between what his legion was asked to pay and the recognition that other legions received for lesser investment. The count became a wound, became a rage, became the specific receptivity to an argument that told him the system he had been sacrificing his legion for was not worth the sacrifice. The Night Haunter needed no special argument. Conrad Kerzay had never fully been loyal in the way that loyalty requires the security of believing in the institution that asks for it. His psychic visions showed him futures of darkness without exception. His philosophy had always been the philosophy of the convinced nihilist, the man who has stared into the void long enough to mistake it for truth. The heresy gave him the confirmation he had always been building toward, that the light had always been temporary, that the darkness was always what came after. These were not failures of the Gene Seed program. These were the Gene Seed program working exactly as designed, producing beings of extraordinary capability and extraordinary interiority, full of the specific depth that makes a person rather than a mechanism. And discovering that interiority of that depth is not fully directable by any design that also requires the person to be genuine. A weapon with no soul cannot turn. It can malfunction, it can be turned by an external force, but it cannot itself decide to be something other than what it is, because what it is all it has. A weapon with a soul can. This is the cost of what the Emperor made. Not a contingent cost, not the result of a specific technical failure that a better version of the program would have avoided. A structural cost, inherent to the decision to make beings with the full depth of personhood rather than beings without it. The depth of personhood was what made the legions magnificent, what made them more than armies, what made them the specific, extraordinary things they were at the height of the Crusade. And the depth of personhood was what made them capable of turning, capable of the heresy, capable of what happened when the wounds and the questions and the unresolved contradictions of 2 centuries of campaign found an argument compelling enough to redirect the loyalty rather than simply breaking it. The Emperor had known some of this. The evidence suggests he had not known all of it. The specific degree to which beings of the Primarch's nature could be corrupted by the chaos powers, the specific speed with which that corruption could move through a being who was, by design, extraordinary in every dimension, including the dimension of spiritual and psychic vulnerability, this was not something that even the Emperor's experience had fully prepared him for. He had planned for a long crusade and then the management of the Imperium it built. He had not planned for this. No one had planned for this. And when it came with the full weight of everything the Crusade had made. The extraordinary weapons, pointed inward, bringing to the destruction of the Imperium the same extraordinary completeness that they had brought to its construction. The heresy ended. The word ended is doing significant work in that sentence, compressing into a single moment what was actually a long and complicated process of dispersal and pursuit and reconstruction, the great scouring that drove the traitor legions back to the Eye of Terra, and the period of rebuilding that followed. But something was over. And what was over was the specific arrangement that the Crusade had been. The legions and their primarchs, the vast armies of space marines operating at legion strength. The concentration of post-human military power in the hands of individuals whose capability and loyalty the heresy had now definitively demonstrated could not be assumed to run parallel indefinitely. The surviving Primarchs faced what remained of the Imperium they had helped to build, and the most immediate practical question they faced was the same one the Emperor would have faced, had he been in any condition to face it. What do you do with the legions? Robert Guillemon answered that question. The Ultramarines Primarch, who had survived the heresy with his legion and his faculties substantially intact, and who possessed the specific genius for institutional thinking that made him the person the Imperium needed in the specific situation the heresy had left, wrote the Codex Astartes. The Codex Astartes was many things: a tactical manual, a statement of military doctrine, a guide to the organization of Space Marine forces that would be referenced for 10,000 years. But it was also, at its most fundamental level, an answer to the terrible question that the heresy had raised about weapons with souls. The answer was not to remove the souls. The attempt to make Space Marines without the depth of personhood that made the heresy possible would have produced something closer to the Thunder Warriors than to the Legions. And the Thunder Warriors' story already demonstrated where that led. The soul, the interiority, the genuine community of the Legion. These were not optional additions that could be removed to make the weapon safer without making it something other than what it was. They were structural to what the Space Marine was. The Codex's answer was distribution. Not fewer beings of extraordinary capability, but the same beings organized in ways that prevented the catastrophic concentration of that capability in the hands of individuals whose wounds might redirect it. A chapter of 1,000 warriors, rather than a legion of tens of thousands. a structure in which no single primarch, no single commander could sweep an entire army into the service of a cause that had diverged from the emperor's. The maximum unit of loyal force deliberately kept below the minimum unit of disloyal force that the heresy had required. It was wise. It was also, as all wise solutions to structural problems are, a management of the problem rather than a resolution of it. The chapters still had souls. The warriors of the Adeptus Astartes in the 10,000 years since the heresy have still carried within them the depth of personhood that was always going to be the cost of the full excellence the Emperor built into them. They have still been capable in individual cases of the turning, of the specific corruption that their extraordinary interiority made possible along with everything else. The Codex did not prevent this. It prevented the scale at which individual instances of this could operate. One heretical space marine is a problem. One heretical legion was the heresy. The chapters live within this arrangement, and they have lived within it for 10,000 years, and they have done something with those 10,000 years that the first space marines who emerged from the gene seed process and tried to understand what they had become could not have fully anticipated, though perhaps they might have hoped for it. They became their own thing. Not the Emperor's weapons exactly, that framing was never quite adequate, even in the age when it was most true. Not the Crusade's instruments, a category that ceased to have a straightforward referent when the Crusade ended. Something that grew out of those beginnings and became, over 10,000 years of service and loss, and the specific ongoing project of being the things they were in the conditions that the galaxy provided. A tradition. The Adeptus Astartes are the Emperor's finest creation, the statement that the Imperium uses in its liturgy, and that is, in its way, accurate. But finest creation is too simple for what they are. They are also the most complicated creation, the one whose development most exceeded its design parameters, whose character and culture and the specific wealth of what they have become over 10 millennia of existence most clearly exceeds the original specification. They were designed to be weapons. They are that. They are also communities, with traditions and histories and cultures of extraordinary richness and variety, each chapter carrying its own specific character as the expression of its particular gene seed inheritance, and its particular history, and the particular conditions of its particular homeworld. They are scholars of the things they have fought and survived, keepers of the memory of the Crusade and the heresy, and the 10,000 years of war since, bearers of traditions whose origins reach back to the first days of the program, and that have been modified and elaborated by 10,000 years of the people who lived inside them. They mourn their dead in the specific rituals of each chapter's tradition. They celebrate their victories, and they remember their failures, and they carry both forward as the ongoing conversation that a living culture has with its own past. They form the bonds of brotherhood that 200 years of the Crusade's campaigns first produced in the Lunar Wolves and the Word Bearers and the Space Wolves and the rest, and they maintain those bonds across lifetimes that can exceed 3 centuries. And they find in those bonds the specific meaning that the purpose of the weapon alone was always insufficient to provide. The question that the first Space Marines were beginning to ask, what is a weapon when it is not being used? What is the soul inside the weapon for? What is the interior life of a post-human warrior supposed to look like across a career of centuries? That question has not been answered with finality in 10,000 years. But it has been answered in practice, which is the way that living traditions answer questions. By demonstrating rather than declaring. The practice of being an Astartes across 10,000 years looks like this. You serve, and you lose brothers, and you endure the loss, and you serve again. You carry the weight of what you are without being destroyed by it, which takes exactly the emotional resources that the question of what to do with those emotional resources produces. You carry, alongside the gene seed and the doctrine and the training, the particular individual reality of who you were before the transformation and who you have become since. And you find in the tension between those two things what makes you the thing the Imperium needs, rather than simply the thing the Imperium can make. You are not only a weapon, you are a person who is also a weapon, in the specific and sometimes painful way that the combination requires. And the personhood is not optional, and the weapon is not optional, and the combination is what the Emperor built and what 10,000 years have refined, and what the galaxy would be worse off without. This is what survived the heresy, not the legions, not the Primarchs in any form that the Crusade would have recognized, not the specific arrangement that the Crusade had been. What survived was the Astartes themselves, the specific beings that the program had produced, distributed into chapters and sent to the corners of the galaxy that needed them, carrying the question forward, because the question could not be resolved, and the carrying was what they could do. They have been carrying it ever since. Take a step back from the events, from the unification and the Thunder Warriors and the scattered Primarchs and the Crusade and the heresy and the 10,000 years that followed. Take a step back and look at what the Emperor actually built, assessed without either the hagiography that the Imperium's official mythology applies to it, or the cynicism that the heresy invites. He took a species that had nearly destroyed itself in the Age of Strife, that was scattered and isolated and fighting itself on 100 surviving worlds, and he reclaimed enough of it to ensure that it would persist, not flourish, not in the way that the optimistic version of the Emperor's vision described. Persist, the Imperium of Man, for all its corruption and its stagnation and its 10,000 years of war and the specific horrors of what it has become, is human civilization continuing to exist in a galaxy that has been trying to end it since before humanity reached the stars. That continuation is the Emperor's achievement, and it is, by any serious reckoning, extraordinary. The Space Marines are the primary instrument through which that continuation was secured, and through which it is maintained. They are the force that holds the fronts that would otherwise collapse, that drives the campaigns that would otherwise fail, that provides military capability of a kind that the difference between the Imperium surviving and the Imperium ending frequently reduces to. Without the Astartes, the Imperium does not exist in any form that the word Imperium adequately describes. It might persist as something, some scattered remnant of human civilization trying to survive in the dark. With them it endures as an institution, as a structure, as the thing that humanity has instead of extinction. This is what the Emperor built when he built the Space Marine, not a perfect solution. The heresy saw to that conclusion, if anyone had been inclined to draw it before. Not a costless solution. The Thunder Warriors were the cost of the first attempt. The Primarch's wounds were the cost of the second. The 10,000 years of Astartes sacrifice are the ongoing cost of the maintenance, not a solution that resolves the terrible question at its center. Because the question cannot be resolved, and the Emperor, who understood this, built beings who were capable of living within the question, rather than beings who had somehow transcended it. What he built was adequate. Not adequate in the diminished sense of sufficient to muddle through, but adequate in the sense of being exactly what the situation required. A form of military capability that the galaxy could not defeat, and that the humans who needed it to survive could maintain and replenish and trust, to the degree that anything in the galaxy is trustable, to protect them from the things that would otherwise be the end of everything. Consider what the alternatives were. Without the Thunder Warriors, the unification would have taken longer, perhaps much longer, and every decade of delay was another decade in which the specific vulnerabilities of the Age of Strife were available to be exploited by the things that were exploiting them. Without the Space Marine program, the Crusade would have been prosecuted with the army alone. And the army alone, however vast and however committed, was not what the galaxy needed fighting it in the specific period of the early Crusade. Without the Primarchs, the legions would have remained the partially formed things they had been in the years before the Primarchs were found, missing the specific center that each Primarch provided, less than what they became, and what they became was barely adequate. At every point, the Emperor made the choice that the situation required, not the choice that the situation allowed without cost. The Thunder Warriors were the choice that the unification required, knowing what they would become and what would have to be done with them. The Primarchs were the choice that the Crusade required, knowing that the worlds that shaped them were beyond his control, and that what those worlds would make of his sons would not always align with what he needed them to be. The Gene Seed and the Legions were the choice that permanence required, knowing that permanence in beings of this kind would produce depth of character, and depth of character would produce the specific vulnerabilities of the heresy. He made all of these choices. He made them with the understanding that they contained costs he could not avoid and still make the choice that the situation required. And the sum of those choices is the Imperium. And the Imperium is, by the standard of the available alternatives, something rather than nothing. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and it is not meant to be. The Thunder Warriors who were discarded deserve more than a conclusion that their discarding was necessary and therefore acceptable. The Primarchs who were wounded by their worlds deserve more than a conclusion that the wounding was an acceptable cost of a plan that was otherwise well designed. The billions of lives spent in the heresy and the 10,000 years of the ongoing war deserve more than the cold calculation that spending them was better than the alternative. The Emperor did not pretend otherwise, so far as the records indicate. He was not in the business of pretending that the cost was less than it was, of managing the moral reckoning by reducing the costs rather than by honestly facing them. He faced them. He paid them. He continued because continuing was the only option that accomplished what needed to be accomplished. And he did not dress the continuing up as costless, or the costs as something other than costs. This is one of the things about the Emperor that is hardest to hold in both hands simultaneously. The specific combination of genuine extraordinary care for humanity and genuine extraordinary willingness to spend it. He loved what he was protecting, in whatever sense a being of his nature was capable of love, with the specific passion of a man who had watched humanity almost destroy itself, and who had devoted everything he was to preventing the completion of that destruction. He also spent humanity with a freedom that the love does not, from the outside, seem to warrant. The reconciliation of these two qualities is not available in a form that makes the reckoning simple. The Emperor was capable of both, and both were real, and the project he built from both was the Imperium. and the Imperium is what it is. The Space Marines are the place where this is most visible. They are the product of his love and his willingness to spend simultaneously, built with extraordinary care and with extraordinary cost, given the depth of personhood that the love required and the purpose of instruments that the willingness to spend required, maintained in the tension between those two requirements for 10,000 years. They are his finest creation, the clearest expression of everything he was, magnificent, necessary, morally complicated, and more than what they were designed to be. The Adeptus Astartes do not resolve the terrible question at their center. They do not and cannot, and the 10,000 years of their existence have not produced the resolution. But they carry it. Every chapter, every warrior, every initiate who survives the gene seed process and emerges into the extraordinary existence that the process produces, carries forward the question that the first Space Marines were already asking in the earliest days of the Crusade. What do you do when the weapon has a soul? You live in the question. You serve the purpose you were given, and you carry the self that the living of that purpose produces. And you hold both without letting either destroy the other. And you find in the holding what the galaxy needs you to be. This is what the Emperor made. This is what it costs. And this is what has held the line for 10,000 years against everything the galaxy has thrown against it. There is a recruit somewhere in the galaxy who will become a Space Marine. He does not know this yet. He is living the life that the world that shaped him allows him to live. On a feral world, perhaps, where the specific brutality of the environment has already made him something that ordinary human development in more comfortable circumstances does not produce. Or on an hive world in the underhive, in the conditions of competitive violence and survival that the hivers who live longest in the underhive are forged by, or on a night world where the feudal tradition includes the expectation that the best of the nobility's sons will be tested by the local chapter, and where he has grown up knowing that the testing exists, and carrying toward it the specific ambition of someone who has been told all his life that the testing is the highest aspiration available. He will be selected, not chosen in the way of elections or competitions, with the criteria announced in advance and the process transparent to the candidates, chosen in the way that the Astartes have always chosen, through observation, through the specific assessment of qualities that the chapter's experience has told it to look for, through tests that are not announced as tests, and that succeed precisely because the candidate who would perform differently if he knew the stakes is not the candidate the chapter needs. He will undergo the transformation, the 19 organ implants over the years that the process requires, the specific changes that the gene seed produces in a human body that has been selected for the capacity to accept them. The bones remaking, the muscles replacing themselves with something that does the same job differently and better. The slow, extraordinary change of becoming something he cannot fully perceive from inside, visible to him only in the specific accumulating evidence of what he can now do that he could not do before, of what the world now looks like through senses that have become more than they were. He will emerge as a Space Marine, as a member of a community that is also an army, that is also a tradition, that is also a 10,000-year-old ongoing conversation with the question of what it means to be what the Gene Seed program produced. He will be given a name in his new existence, and the name will carry the weight of everything that name has meant in his chapter's history. The battles fought under that name, the brothers who bore it before him, the specific accumulated tradition that he is now a member of, and that will shape him as surely as the gene seed has shaped his body. He will not know most of this in the beginning. He will know his doctrine and his training, and the immediate community of brothers in the formation he joined. He will know the chapter's mythology as taught to him in his initiation, the story of his chapter's founding and its primarch, and its great campaigns, and the traditions that express what the chapter believes itself to be. He will be told who he is and what he is for, as institutions tell their members these things, and he will take the telling in and make it part of how he understands himself. And then he will go on campaign, and the campaign will begin to teach him things that the telling did not. Things that only the specific experience of being the thing he has become can teach. Things about what he is that the training and the mythology could point toward but not fully reach. He will find out what the question feels like from inside. This is the story that the first Space Marines began, and that has been continuing ever since. Not the story that the Imperium's official mythology tells, the clean story of the Emperor's angels fighting in his name, invincible servants of divine will. The actual story, the one that lives inside the mythology rather than replacing it, the story of beings who were made for a purpose, and who are more than their purpose, and who carry that excess alongside the purpose through everything they do. The galaxy that contains them has not become simpler since the first Thunder Warrior was made on the eve of the unification. It has, in most respects, become significantly more complicated. The enemies are older and stranger, and more varied than the warlords of the strife who the Thunder Warriors were built to break. The warp is more turbulent, the powers within it more ambitious, the veil between the immaterium and real space thinner in more places than it was when the Crusade began. The Imperium that the Space Marines serve and protect is a different thing from the project that the Emperor intended, shaped by 10,000 years of the specific pressures that 10,000 years of existence under these conditions produces, in some respects deeply corrupted from what it was meant to be. And in the middle of all of this, in every chapter that carries the gene seed of a primarch and maintains the traditions of a community that has been making Astartes for as long as the Imperium has existed, the question continues. The question the Thunder Warriors could not ask because they were not stable enough to formulate it. The question the first Space Marines began asking in the earliest years of the Crusade. The question that the Primarchs, each in their own way, answered differently. Some with devotion and some with doubt, and some with the specific catastrophic certainty that produced the heresy. The question that the chapters of the second founding and every founding since have been living inside for 10,000 years, answering in practice if not in declaration. Through the specific ongoing work of being Space Marines in the galaxy that contains them. What are we? Not what were we made to be? That question has an answer, stated plainly in the Gene Seed program's objectives and the Crusade's strategic goals, and the Codex Astartes doctrine. What are we? The people who happen to be inside the weapons that those objectives require. The selves that have grown up alongside the purpose and that are not reducible to the purpose even after 10,000 years of being defined by it? The answer is not in any document. Not in the Codex Astartes, or the liturgy of the Imperial Creed, or the chapter chronicles that the scribes maintain and that the new initiates read in their training. The answer is in what they do with the question. in the specific ongoing process of being Astartes, of carrying the purpose and the self simultaneously, of finding in the work of protection and battle and the maintenance of the community of brothers the specific thing that makes the existence more than adequate to what the existence requires. The Emperor built more than he planned. He built weapons, and he built beings. And the beings grew inside the weapons across 10,000 years of the galaxy's cruelty and complexity. And what the beings have become is not reducible to what the weapons were designed to be. This is not a failure of the design. It is the most extraordinary thing about it. He built something that could become more than he intended. And it did, and it still is, and somewhere in the galaxy right now a space marine stands in a position that should not be holdable and holds it, not only because the gene seed has made him capable of holding it, but because the specific person inside the gene seed has decided that the holding is what he is for, not the Emperor's decision, not the Codex's instruction, his own. Made in the specific interior of a self that the program produced and could not fully contain. The first Space Marines asked what they were. They were still asking when the heresy came. They are still asking now, 10,000 years later, in the specific quiet interior of a humanity that has transcended humanity's limits and not yet found the language for what it has become. The Thunder Warriors were the shadow. The Astartes are what the light made when it casted. The question of what that is will not be answered before the galaxy ends. It may not be answered even then. The Astartes will still be asking it when the answer comes.